Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Atheist Reformation. Joining us on a Saturday morning here at around 11:50, almost noon now. We had a little bit of technical difficulty starting up, but hey, we are all good and ready to go now. Here with me today to discuss the historicity of the Bible is a man by the name of William Albrecht. He is a owner and manager of the website patristicpillars.com. He is also a Catholic apologist and debater and has debated on the Reason and Theology channel, especially the likes of Mr. John Loftus, an atheist author and activist, as well as had a live discussion with Dr. Robert Price, probably one of the most preeminent scholars on the New Testament. So, William, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about the issues regarding the historicity of the Bible.
Indeed, I'm glad you were able to take the time to come on and discuss this. Now, I remember hearing that we had talked in the past that you had a couple of books coming out. Are we still being cagey with the titles, or can we get a bit of a sneak peek on what's going on with that?
Yeah, I've got two that are pretty much wrapped up already. They're in the final stages. And I've got another one that I'm currently working on. The third one that I'm working on right now is actually the historicity of the resurrection as the way it was approached in the early church amongst the church fathers. That is going to be a unique take. The other two, my first one, and really my baby that I've been working on for a few years now is a pretty big book that I've been working on in how the early church viewed purgatory. And my other one is a unique title. I think that your audience, and I think a number of people will be very surprised to hear that I'm also working on a book that will touch upon how the early church viewed alcohol and whether or not it was viewed in a permissible manner. As a German, that interested me very much, and I looked at the landscape and I saw that there were no books really like it out there. There were a lot that maybe tackled the usage of alcohol in the Bible, but in the terms of the way the early church viewed it, how the church fathers, early church councils talked about it, I've yet to find anything like it out there, and I think it's going to be very, very unique.
All right, well, that sounds actually really pretty awesome. I'll be interested to read on the alcohol book. That's
Yeah.
for sure. Especially with me having a German background myself, so
Yes,
that'll
definitely.
always be interesting. All right, so we're here to discuss the historicity of the Bible today, as we previously mentioned. So I figured we might as well get right down to it. You said you wanted to stick mainly to Old Testament today and run with that. So is there any particular
Yeah.
place, since you're the one coming on here, you're the one that, well, this is more of a discussion, not necessarily a debate, but you'll be the one essentially defending the historical accuracy of of the Bible itself. So is there anywhere in particular you'd like to start? And while you're
Yeah,
doing that, I'm going to actually turn my light on.
and you know what? I am willing to open up the parameters to discuss in the New Testament as well if need be. I don't mind. I enjoy talking about both of them. I know that the Old Testament itself is such a broad issue that I know it can take up a number of several hours. But just judging by the fact that we've got a good amount of time today and tomorrow, I think we can be able to talk about both. I think that I think I approach the Old Testament in a very different manner than a number of individuals would, perhaps. I think by the very fact that we have the Septuagint, we have so many manuscripts of the Septuagint that exist to this day, a number of them in very, very good condition. I think that is testimony in and of itself that we have a pretty good idea of what the message of the Old Testament was. And I know you've got people that are that are uh, really hell bent on the Hebrew text, and they really say, well, you know what? If, we need to get back as close as possible to the original Hebrew, or what have you. I think the fact that we have the Old Testament preserved at an early time in history in Greek, I think that that is a very good witness to the fact that we do have a very good a very good idea of what the Old Testament message was, and is. I think that that's a great example, and I'm not sure if you've ever heard that brought up before.
I have heard that brought up once or twice. Actually, I think maybe Dr. Price had referenced the Greek Septuagint in our discussion with him back on Reason and Theology with Mike
Yeah,
and Craig. Um, so that does it does in a way kind of establish a bit of a historical case for the Bible being accurate as far as it says what it says, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question of the claims of how accurate are the claims that are made within the text.
no doubt, definitely,
Because
I agree.
I think a big misconception, and I'm not saying you run into this. I've encountered this in discussions with fundamentalists more often than not, is this misconception that the Bible itself is the evidence, when in fact it is actually the claim.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
so they seem to have, I'm not sure if it's mental gymnastics or if it's just something along the lines of they're just not able to overcome that small amount of cognitive dissonance
yeah,
to have a discussion about that. It's either all or nothing. And whether or not something is truly historical accurate within the Bible, that's not going to discount something else being true. Will it make it more likely that it could be proven not to be accurate? Sure. But that doesn't discount it whole cloth. And I think that's what a lot of people seem to be afraid of more than anything else, is that, okay, we're able to dismiss one or two particular claims, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we throw everything out.
yeah. You're making a great point there, and that is, I think, really the heart of the issue. Because when we talk about the historicity of the Bible, I guess they're different categories. We can perhaps show the veracity of the text in terms of being able to get to what the original really said, really meant. But then you enter a whole other realm when you're talking about, okay, well, the author may have written that. We can ascertain that he really wrote that, really meant that. But then you get to the point of, well, was he using a literary device? Was he trying to be literal? Was he injecting hyperbole here? Is this meant to be a historical event? And of course, there are different categories, and I think that that is important to recognize, because if we don't recognize that, then we become kind of like a fundamentalist individual that takes everything in a literalist manner. And I think that when we go into that kind of a realm, I think a number of problems open up. I don't think every jot and tittle in the text is meant to be taken in a literalist type of manner. I think a lot of it, in fact, is a good amount, at least in the Old Testament in particular, is told in a in a moral kind of way. Perhaps some stories are not 100% accurate, and I know some people might be saying, well, what are you talking about? I do believe that the tale of Job, I do believe, for instance, that that is historical truth. But I think perhaps some parts of the story were meant to look at it in a different kind of manner, like kind of like being a moral lesson being taught. And I think that we look at the way the early church fathers wrote, in particular John Chrysostom, we see that kind of tendency go on even into their writings. For instance, John Chrysostom, he uses Mary a number of times as an example, um, kind of like really taking her life out of context to say, well, what if Mary had sinned in this kind of manner? Then this means this and this means that about God. So I think we really, really need to really examine the text. And I think that the way that a Catholic, or even an Orthodox for that matter, the way they approach a text is very different from a fundamentalist. Because if I approach a text, for example, Drew, I would look at it, and I don't just look at the text. I would like to see, well, what do the earliest Jewish sources say about it, the earliest commentators, and what do the earliest Christians say about this text? what was being preached from the pulpit, and I think that is very important as well to go along with the way we look at the text.
No, I agree with you on that one. Now, Job is not one that I put a whole lot of study into on this for our discussion today, and the primary reason for that was more in an effort to avoid it turning into debating over whether or not God and Satan actually exist, since
Mm,
that's primarily what the book of Job is about. It's the test of Job.
right.
And so I wanted to kind of avoid that. Now I'm not doing that to dismiss a potential historical claim, more to avoid getting off track, getting off focus.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Oh, and the only reason I even brought up Job was to show that the Old Testament does include some stories that will have historical elements within them, and then they can also have perhaps some pieces of the story that aren't meant to be taken in a literal type of fashion.
Right, and correct me if I'm wrong. There's actually a field of study on that, at least at theological colleges, seminaries, and the like, called
Correct.
hermeneutics that seeks to identify these literary devices on how what is being expressed in a literal sense as being expressed as a factual accounting of an event versus an allegorical retelling of an event versus
Mhm.
parable, and then of course these moral allegories
Yeah,
that you
definitely.
kind of run into.
Oh, yeah, definitely, no
Now,
doubt.
now there's one thing that you kind of run into a lot, and I'm sorry to kind of like not necessarily shoehorn fundamentalism on you, but I bring these up because these are the most common arguments about things being historically accurate in the Bible. In fact, I'm not even going to touch on all the big at this, big at that, because we've kind of identified what the problem is with that.
Hmm.
You have Bishop Usher, and the way he did that math was bad to say the least. I mean, but I don't necessarily fault him too much for it, aside from the fact that he didn't understand what mathematics was at the time. I mean, back then the way things were written, you had this hexadecimal system that was base 60, and
Hmm.
then they didn't have a zero, and so it made all those things, especially dates, ages, and all that stuff, completely off the wall.
Yeah.
And that's why you end up with people being described as living for 1,000 years, or a king reigning for what was it, like 22 or 26,000 years, something like that.
Yeah, yeah, definitely not meant to be taken in a literal manner. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
definitely.
some people think that they may have managed to identify a way to kind of convert that numeral system into modern numerals, and it doesn't seem to work in every possible instance, but it seems to work in most of them, such as like the one king that was said to have ruled for 22,500 years. I can't remember the formula off the top of my head. I think R and Ross spoke about it at one point, where it brought it down to where the reign was essentially somewhere in the realm of 20 to 25 years in total, which would make a lot more sense.
It would
Uh,
definitely.
but there again, if you were to apply that same thing, especially if you were doing a base 10 conversion to someone like, say, Methuselah, he lived to be what, 987, something like that.
Right. Yes.
Um, if you're getting essentially 25 years out of 22,500, if someone's 987 years old, then by that math, technically they should only live for about, what is it, 9.5 years?
Right. Yeah. So you do have problems that arise regardless. Yes,
Oh
you're
yeah,
right about that.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. No
And see,
doubt.
that's why I tend to stay away from the mathematical side of things, just because we have so little understanding of numeric systems of the biblical day, aside from this base 60 Babylonian hexadecimal system that we still use even today for trigonometry. I mean, most people get weirded out when people say the word trigonometry. Long story short, folks, it's basically how do we cut up the circle?
Yeah. Very true. Yeah. You're correct about that.
And so it's like, but it can be a little intimidating because you have all these different variables. It's like, you've got alphabet soup plus math.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I really do think you're bringing up a good point. I realize how in theology, when you dialogue about a number of statements you can find in the Bible of individuals living a certain amount of time, there's a problem with the text, and in the terms of how long Samuel reigned and all sorts of things here. I think that there are different realms within theology. You've got the fundamentalist individuals who really, really are on another level in terms of it's really difficult to dialogue with them in an intellectual manner. And it's unfortunate that really people in the Catholic and Orthodox and other camps that are really attempting to dialogue in an intellectual manner, it's unfortunate that sometimes they get lumped in with them. But it's the nature of the beast, really. I mean,
Well,
because
it's not just the nature of the beast. I think a lot of it has to do with these individuals that are leading these churches, because you see a lot of these described as cults. And I have to say, I do kind of have to agree, especially when you look at one of our principal academic methods of identifying cults, which is the BITE model. BITE being an acronym for behavior control, information control,
oh yeah,
thought control, and then emotional control. And a
oh
lot
yeah,
of these do all four of these things, at least to a certain degree. Um, but it's not necessarily that I think they should be labeled cults, because cults are essentially just a fervent religious belief or a fervent religious following. Yes, it has a negative connotation now due to colloquial reappropriation of the term.
yeah.
I mean, but
But even in Spanish, the term cult does not carry with it a negative connotation. So
well, no,
you're
because
bringing up a good point.
right,
That's
no,
a good
because
point.
even within Catholicism, the cults are referenced. You have
Yes,
the
yes,
cult of Mary,
exactly.
and then
Yeah.
you have it's not necessarily referred to as the cult of, but Opus Dei
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
when
I
they were
agree.
really
Yeah.
active.
Of course. Yeah. So it can carry with itself a positive connotation and a negative one. The negative one seems to be what people focus on nowadays. Seems to be really. You talk to a regular person off the street, and you use that term, and right away they're going to think in a negative kind of way. Uh,
Especially when you're speaking
yeah.
about a belief structure. But you look
Yes.
at how we deal with things in the media and stuff like that, and you walk that back to things like the family, the
Yeah.
Manson family, the Branch Dravidians, Jonestown, those type of places, and they were labeled as cults because they didn't really have a better word for it, and they didn't want to label them religious extremists because we
Yeah.
really hadn't gotten quite that far down what George Carlin once called the euphemistic hellhole.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with you. Yeah. And as you point out, there can be a positive way of discussing cult as well. But to me, really, if you kind of pull away all the layers and really get to what is really the heart of the issue, I think we can identify a number of problems in the sense of how are you approaching the text. I think within fundamentalism, I think the mere fact, and I know this is not going to sound very good to my Protestant friends, but I
Well,
think the
tell
mere
you what.
fact,
Why don't
yeah,
I say what I think you're going to say for you?
go ahead.
I think it's a big issue with them attempting to approach the entire text from a pure literalist interpretation rather than taking
Yes,
the text for what it is. There,
you're right.
I'll jump
Yeah,
on that grenade for you.
you're right. Yes, you're 100% right. That's exactly what I was going to say. And I think when they do that, I think the very essence of one of their key pillars of faith in sola scriptura, I find that to be a very, very, very problematic position to take.
I do as well, because you end up having to defend things like the global flood as it's described, even though it's described in a couple of different ways,
Mhm.
and we can easily refute the entirety of it just with science alone, uh, and we can do it from a number of different angles. Like, for instance, there's just not enough water. There hasn't been enough water. There's nowhere for it to go. I mean, even if we melted the polar ice caps, it still wouldn't amount to 15 cubits above the highest mountain, which is arguably somewhere between like 30 and 40 feet.
Yeah,
Um, if my head conversion is correct, and On top of that, from a physics standpoint, it doesn't work. It would actually, that much water would create such a monstrous greenhouse effect that the surface temperature of the planet would increase by hundreds of degrees. I mean, Noah and crew's lungs would have exploded.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that the one thing that I have found very interesting is the way the early church fathers viewed the flood, because a number of them viewed it in a very different manner. So you've got, you don't have every single one of them taking it as having submerged the entire earth. You have differing views. For instance, you've got a different view in Clement of Alexandria. You have a different one in Augustine. So you don't have to take that in an exactly literalist type of manner either. I think that Justin Martyr did believe that the flood did submerge the entire earth, but once you reach the era of Thomas Aquinas, you have this really being discussed in a different manner. You have individuals who still don't, as you know, still don't have all the data that we would have today in our hands at our disposal, but really kind of approach it in a different manner, and I guess not taking it in a completely literal type of way as well. So there is a variance in that in the way they approach that as well.
I agree, and pardon me. Some of the key historical issues that I take with it, at least from a scientific standpoint, and this is for anyone who takes this story literally. I know that you, William, you don't really seem to, but I am going to go ahead and address these points. This is as much for listeners and viewers than the two of us. Otherwise, what are we doing other than just stroking our own egos?
Correct.
So the issues that I find with the global flood is that we don't have any evidence for the human population ever being as low as just 8 individuals. On top of that, we even have genomic analysis that says that there was never a time in human history when we have defined Homo sapiens that were less than 1,500 genetically unique individuals. I mean, so that kind of alone refutes a good portion of that, at least from a literalist standpoint, just in the fact that we would not have the amount of genetic diversity we have today just in human beings if that had happened. And on top of that, you have to take other things into account. It's like, why don't we find any fossilized evidence of kangaroos and koalas and animals that are unique to Australia anywhere along the Middle Eastern, sub-Asian continent?
Right. Yeah. And even if you look, and I don't remember where it is, but even if you look at the words of Pope Pius XII, he does himself even note how, in particular, Genesis 6 to 8 does include metaphorical language. So I think that you do run into a number of issues if you attempt to really try to stick to the literal kind of reading of this text. The way I see it, the church has never prohibited having different interpretations of those passages. And if you look at the way the earliest theologians have interpreted those passages, they have been different throughout history. So I would I do agree with Pope Pius XII's language, that there is metaphorical language in there, and I don't have a problem with individuals looking at it, coming to it from a different perspective at all. I think that if you look at the evidence and you say, well, there really is no strong evidence that the world was ever completely inundated, and then you in turn take this text to be referring to something in a metaphorical manner, I don't think you have a problem with it. I think that
I would go so far as to wager it was more of a tact of essentially arguably fundamentalists back in the day, back when these accounts were being written down, that it's not necessarily just a metaphorical account, it's a series of religious one-upmanships, because you have these flood legends all around the world. Most of them don't even talk about a worldwide flood. They talk about localized floods, and things like that. And we even have flood legends in ancient Mesopotamia that talk about localized floods, and that we even have evidence of a pretty bad local flood, not more than a few hundred years prior to what we believe is the accurate dated writing of Genesis.
Hmm.
And so it seems as though it's the possibility of these individuals upselling, so to speak,
Yeah, and even
taking
Pope
that.
Pius XII notes that in Humani Generis, he does point that
Mhm.
out as well. It just escapes me exactly where it is, but he does point out how even beforehand, even before these writers speak about, for instance, the flood, even the Tower of Babel, he does note how there is similar language that was used even beforehand. Um, I'm not sure exactly how. I'm not sure exactly how all of the fathers approach that. I know that when we look at the way, because Justin Martyr does tackle that head on, and I'm not sure if his would be satisfying to most modern day theologians, but he argues that even though these stories existed beforehand, he says that the writers of the biblical text are not ripping and not copying, but rather they're showing the similarities in in these stories that existed beforehand, and they're borrowing certain elements to show the similarities and to show that these events that are spoken of beforehand, they may have occurred at a time before, such as stories like the Tower of Babel and floods in other areas.
Mhm.
But he attributes these events, believe it or not, as odd as it may seem to some people, he says that these stories written by pagan individuals, some of them may contain historical truths within them, which I don't doubt. I don't doubt, even as fantastical as the tales may be, I don't doubt that they may have some element of truth in them as well. Not in the sense of inundating the whole world, but perhaps devastating floods that when the author viewed them and wrote them, he may have seen something, you know what, this has been horrible, this has taken so many lives, may have thought that this really did cover the whole world, when in reality, you just covered that particular area that he presided in.
No, that that sounds at the very least plausible. Can we really state to any definitive amount that's definitely how it happened? Of course not. We weren't there, and unfortunately, evidence, while it is growing, or anthropological and archaeological evidence are growing for that time period in that region, is still the climate and the cultures of the day really kind of make things difficult, because cultures, instead of preserving history, had a very distinct tendency for just wiping each other out and trying to erase their very existence as much as humanly possible.
Oh, no doubt, no doubt. Even during the time period of, even as early as the first and second, third and fourth century in church history, even when Catholicism was being persecuted, the early church did attempt to wipe out the writings of Gnosticism, and I kind of don't blame them. I do see the problems within the texts. So, for instance, in the Valentinian texts, I see a huge problem there. So I kind of don't blame them if you look at it from the perspective of, you know what, this is already a tiny group of persecuted individuals, and their flock are being driven out, and they're being led into other forms of really radical forms of Christianity that were never meant to be part of the faith. So they try to do their best to eradicate their writings, not to, I guess, not in a malicious way, but in a way to kind of preserve their flock and keep the chain of apostolic tradition passed down in a more traditionally golden fashion rather than a corrupt fashion, as Gnosticism tended to do to the faith. So even during that period, and how do we know this is a fact? Well, during the time of Athanasius, so many texts that were just tossed into vases have survived. You know, they were found several hundreds of years later. A number of them complete texts. Like if we look at the text from Qumran, it's just incredible how you can tell that these individuals are being persecuted. They knew they were trying to be wiped out and eradicated, so they did their best to save their writings, to preserve them. And I wonder, Drew, I wonder how many writings, how many civilizations, even if you will, if we talk about pre-Christianity, have we lost knowledge of because they were just wiped out? It's really interesting thinking about that.
Yeah, I do think it is pretty interesting. Although to some degree, it does that level of fundamentalism does create potential issues, especially even during the early church. I
It
mean, we've
does.
we've we've talked about this before, kind of in passing, um, about individuals such as Cyril of Alexandria, and his being unfortunately quite complicit uh, in the death of someone who was a renowned thinker and educator, Hypatia.
Yeah, and I don't agree with that though. I will definitely challenge. I don't think that is true, and we just don't have any evidence of that. I
We have evidence of a massive smear campaign that he ran against her. That's the thing that we have the evidence of. Now, am I saying he was instrumental in her death in that he is the one who ordered them to take roof tiles and flay this woman alive? No, 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 no. I'm not arguing that in the
Oh, okay, I
slightest.
got you. Right.
But I am arguing that there's no way to. I don't see there really being an effective way to argue against his complicity in it, even without direct participation in the act,
Well, he
because
wasn't
his
there though.
no, he wasn't there. What I mean by complicit is that he was the one who was smearing her. He was the one who was smearing her publicly, accusing her of
I'm not even sure
witchcraft,
what he
accusing.
said. What did he say? I really, honestly, do not recall. If you could point it to me, I could maybe pop it up right away. I do not recall what he allegedly said, though. Maybe it is in his writings. I don't quite remember.
It's a lot of it seems to come primarily from contemporaries of the day. You
Hmm.
have individuals like Orestes who writes about it. Socrates Scholasticus. Um, yeah, although I'm a little reticent at mentioning Scholasticus for the sheer fact that he declared her murder as being entirely politically motivated, um, because he doesn't mention her paganism. She was a Neoplatonist, as is fairly well known. But as far as her paganism went, her paganism extended merely to the fact that she was neither Christian nor Jew, and that was the thing of the day. Was in Alexandria, you tended to be one of these two groups, and there were very few pagans or those just not of those two particular faiths. And I
Right.
think a
You're
lot of I do think
Scholasticus. Yeah, yeah. I remember that text. But he correct me if I'm wrong, and I might be wrong on this. I have not examined it in a long time. I don't remember Scholasticus ever even mentioning Cyril, though.
he talked about her falling victim to the political jealousy because of uh, her relationship, her friendship with Orestes, and
Okay, but he doesn't mention Cyril, though, does he?
I can't remember if he references Cyril
Oh,
directly, because
I think he
again,
does.
most of my notes are about things in the
I could be
Bible
wrong.
itself,
I
not
could be
not
wrong.
not
I
extra
don't
biblical
remember.
occurrences. But I do agree that that's something that we should probably discuss at some point. Maybe not today.
Yeah. Oh no, no,
Um,
definitely. Yeah. I mean, okay, you kind of caught me a little flat-footed because I don't have those notes with me.
I
But
kind of caught myself a little flat-footed on it
yeah,
as well. It's
I
like I have a
remember
few
that
things
though. I
pulled up,
remember.
but not a whole lot. It
I
was
do
just you.
remember that claim though, and I remember. I mean, I could be proven wrong, so don't take my word for it. But I don't think he ever mentioned Cyril. But I mean, we could even talk about this more at hand tomorrow. Um, I could be wrong though. I mean, I'd like to look more into that.
Oh yeah, no,
Um,
no, no. Yeah, we can definitely look into that. I think that would probably be a great just separate show in general. It's one that
oh, no doubt.
I've
No,
kind
I
of
agree.
pitched before, going with just an overall blanket kind of a roundtable discussion, or trying to at least. And my primary argument being that religious fundamentalism, at least from what we see throughout history, tends to be pretty bad no matter which way you
Oh,
cut it.
I agree, and from an individual such as myself, who I when preparing for debates, I really go to the first-hand source material, and I have found it really unfortunate that I can't find anything from Arius, and I'm sure you know why. I mean, the bishops did their best to eradicate anything, and
Yeah.
even though I tell you, I understand why. I just wish they hadn't done it. I wish they would have preserved a lot of it because I would have gotten a better idea of some of the stuff that he said. Some of it is preserved, but in the sense of original texts of his, I mean, they've most likely been destroyed. We don't have any.
Right, and that's one of the big issues that tends to create problems within Christianity. Like, to touch on a small thing within the New Testament, I know we'll get more into that tomorrow probably. Is the excuse me, uh, the issue that we run into of gosh, train of thought derailed and exploded for a second.
You were going to bring up
Okay,
something from the
the
New
issue of
Testament.
the issue of first century texts, in that after the what we believe to be the execution or the crucifixion of Christ, there seems to be almost a full stop on historical writings that are found beyond about 50 or 60 A.D. Like, we don't find a whole lot prior to that. Um, just for whatever reason, there seems to have been some kind of to get a little conspiratorial on things. It almost seems like they went through and eradicated as much historical evidence of anything going on during that time as much as they could.
You mean from like the period between 70 AD to around 90?
Yes, I believe that's it.
Yeah. That's a good point. Um, it
As to
would
what the
really
motivation
depend
of
how
something
we.
like that would be,
I
I
mean,
have no idea. It could be some vast conspiracy where they were trying to preserve
yeah.
the mythicization of an individual, or it could just be bad luck, or it could be a small political effort here or there.
I
Uh,
mean, it would really depend how we date the Book of Revelation, though,
mm,
um, because some have dated it within that time period. I mean, I really don't know what to say. I mean, it's a good point you bring up there. I mean, I don't think it really makes a difference, even if there was a 20-year period of silence. But I mean, it really would depend on how you date the Book of Revelation, and I've never found any scholarly source that has really given it a definitive dating. Um,
most scholarly seems to assign it to uh, 96
yeah,
CE, and that it's
but even Bart Ehrman has waffled on that. So I mean,
true, true.
I've read some dated to 80. I've read some very conservative dated earlier. I tend to kind of fall into the around the 90 camp. But I mean, again, it's just an issue of we really don't know if all of it was written in that time period. Um, I mean, I really don't know. It's I mean, then we have got later writings like Second Corinthians and
Mhm.
2 Peter and a number of these others that we know were written at later dates. So I mean, it's just I mean, even if there was that period of silence, I don't think it really was a period of eradication. I think that we do have evidence that certain individuals that are talked about in the New Testament then came about and became bishops and continued writing, such as Clement of Rome, individuals like Polycarp and what have you. It could have just been a period of intense persecution in which they just nothing really survived. I imagine. I personally think we've lost a lot of writings of the Apostolic Father era that we really just may never ever find ever again. I mean, because if you really think about it, if we look at the Apostolic Father era, you look at Clement, Shepherd of
Mhm.
Hermas, there's very few.
There's
I
very
mean,
few. You're right,
very little.
and there's also the other possibility. It may not have been eradication. It may not have been things being hidden or intended to be wiped out. It could just simply be that just nobody wrote it.
You're right.
I
Yeah,
mean,
you're right about that.
but then that eventually does beg the question of why the silence? Why this very big gap? I mean, that completely separates it from these writings from being actually contemporaneous with the events, and that's always struck me as interesting to say the very least.
Hmm.
You brought up some of the individuals like Clement. One person that I'm reminded of is Eusebius and some of the things that he referenced, which I
Right.
thought were hilarious to say the least. Like it was either his or Papias's writings where they somehow confused and mixed in an old Syriac apocalypse tale.
Yeah, yeah.
Where they were talking about the vines and the vine shoots and the branches and the grapes and the wine and all that stuff. Funnily enough, I actually did the math on that, and would you like me to run through that real quick? Because it's actually
Sure.
I
Yeah.
thought kind of funny.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Okay, so the whole Syriac apocalypse, for those that aren't familiar, it references a passage in particular where it references there will be numerous of these vines, and each vine will have 10,000 branches, and each branch will have 10,000 vines, and then 10,000 each vine, 10,000 vine shoots, each vine shoot 10,000 clusters, each cluster 10,000 grapes, and then each grape by itself will produce 25 measures of wine. And to kind of put that into context, when you break all that down, that comes to being mathematically represented as 10 to the 8th times 25. So this is 2.5 billion measures of wine that are somehow being produced by a single plant. This is
Right.
by one plant. But then it doesn't really mean much unless you figure out, well, what do they mean by measure? And so I started looking up old ancient Greek measurements, especially liquid volume, and found one that was particularly interesting, called a metrites, which translates into meter, which would quite literally mean measure. And that was a form of liquid measurement then,
Right.
and it was equivalent to a Roman amphora, which was about almost 10.5 gallons, U.S. gallons. So that means that for whatever reason, one of these plants would produce roughly 26 billion gallons of wine.
Wow.
To put that into
That's a
perspective,
lot.
an Olympic-sized swimming pool is about 661,000 gallons.
Yeah, it's a lot.
So you got 40,000 Olympic swimming pools worth of wine coming from a plant.
Right.
I mean, when that if that's not in your book, it should be, because that's for lack of a better term, that's damn funny, I think.
Yeah, there is a portion of that in there, but I don't cover. I'm just really covering
The views on
the
alcohol
positive.
itself. Yeah,
Yes, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, the positive and the negative, and I guess a spoiler alert, but really the massive majority of fathers, I'd say 99%, were very, very pro alcohol as long as it was kept within moderation.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty much the view, throughout most of time, is that they didn't have an issue with drinking; they had an issue with
Yeah,
drunkenness.
yeah,
You
exactly.
even do kind of see that even translating on into the Middle Ages. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, no
like
doubt.
gosh, there's this one um, German Weissbier that I really love, and I cannot remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it's supposed to be like this 1,000-year-old recipe that's from these monks in Germany.
You're
So I
you're,
mean,
you're
like,
talking about Paulaner.
I believe I am. Yes.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most popular ones. Yeah, it's got the monks on the front.
Um. Yes. Well, no, 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 no. Maybe. I don't know. When I had it, it was in a restaurant, and they somehow managed to get a keg and have it as a draft. So
Hmm.
I never actually got to see a bottle or can of it. So
Oh
I wish I
goodness.
had.
Okay, I think that's the one you're talking about. It should be.
I
I
think
mean,
so too.
I
If anyone wants to know where to find it, it's at King's Beer House in Houston.
oh wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the one you're talking about. If it's that old of a recipe, it's got to be the Paulaner, and to kind of anglicize it over here in Texas, we just say Paulaner. And
Yeah.
you go
Yeah.
over there to
Polliner.
Germany, you say Paulaner, and they look at you like, "What are you doing?
Exactly. It's like, what are you doing with my language? Leave it
Yeah, what are
alone.
you
No, back
doing with
off.
my language?" Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but it's. I mean, I don't know if you liked it. I think it's an exceptional
Oh
beer.
no, I found it absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
There's one thing in particular that me and R and Ra agree on to the nth degree, is that is we both despise American pilsners.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I'm with you there.
I
I'm with
mean,
you there.
I guess if you're in a pinch, the old saying is like, if you're at your friend's house and they offer you a beer, it doesn't matter what it is. Your favorite kind of beer is free. Your second
Yeah,
favorite is cold.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that. I completely agree.
One that I found that's actually really awesome. Actually, we're going to steer back to the topic at hand, and then you and I at some point are just going to have a beer stream where we sit and talk
We
about
have to.
where we
We've
just sit
got
and
to.
talk about beer. We'll use that as a precursor to our little thing going on in January.
We've got to do that. We have to.
That sounds like a ton of fun, I think.
Yeah, it does.
So moving on from the flood, we've kind of done that one to death. It's kind of been done to death to a certain degree. I want to bring up the Exodus. I want to bring up the story of Moses.
Sure.
And that's been done to death in a few different ways, such as the potential evidence of him being a composite character, being comprised of individuals like Pharaoh Snefru, Sargon of Akkad, King Hammurabi, all of which predate what the general estimates of Moses' life are by upwards of 1,000 years, some even longer than that. One I wanted to touch on, and this is something that you might be able to help me out with as far as the whole textual criticism side of things, is that it seems kind of odd that an Egyptian princess would give a child a name that is a Hebrew pun, because you come from Heb Mesheti, that's what gets us to Moses, and it's to draw out of.
Right.
But if Hebrew isn't spoken there at all, and we don't have any evidence of Hebrew ever really being spoken around the time that's being talked about for Moses in Egypt. In fact, there's actually evidence that the Hebrews really didn't even leave the Levant region at all during this time, of why she would name a child a Hebrew pun, and not to mention giving him an incomplete name, if it's supposed to be Egyptian, because Moses or Meses or Mises, it just means the son of.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question that you bring up, because we've had a number of scholars, and it seems to even be, even though he doesn't go into great detail about it, it seems like we don't really know exactly the precise era in which Moses did live. I've read a number of different things, a number of different commentaries, a number of individuals that think that, first off, just so people can realize, I do believe that Moses did write part of the Pentateuch. I don't think he wrote all of it. I know there are a number of people that do think he wrote all of it. I think it's very clear that we do have different authors that are writing different things here. But as far as the language goes, I mean, it's tough to really fall upon one side, because so many scholars say so many different things. Like if you look at, for instance, I'm not sure if you were the one that said, or Michael said, we're going to have Michael Brown on soon. But even Michael Brown falls on a different kind of category in terms of that. I mean, it's tough to really know why that name was given to him. I mean, I'm going to
Because
say I
it really
really
doesn't
haven't.
seem to make sense no matter what language you
Yeah,
put it in.
right,
And
right. No, I
so
agree with you in terms of that.
and
I
so
agree.
what
It's very odd. I agree
right
there.
the thing that I kind of lean towards is that I tend to agree with this one thing, is that it seems to be a modification of a story that actually happened. In Egypt, there was a priest or someone there. I can't remember his name, but if you look it up, you should be able to find it. Where he adopted the name Moses, and then fled the region with
That
particular
I've never
followers.
read.
Yeah, it was gosh, it was something to do not with Ramesses, but it was uh,
Yeah, that I've never read of somebody adopting that name. That would be something new to
Atenesis.
me.
I want to.
I've read of names being similar, but then again, we run into so many different textual issues as well. For instance, even if we look at the Code of Hammurabi, I mean, how are we going to date that? There's just so much that is
Right.
just we run into. Like there's, for instance, I've heard that. Well, we were just talking about it right now. A number of people think that the story of Moses, the whole Exodus story, seems to be borrowed. The whole the issue of the Code of Hammurabi being similar to that of the Ten Commandments. Um,
Well, the Code of Hammurabi, the Steel of Law, actually
Predates it.
predates
Oh, no
predates at least
doubt.
the asserted times
Oh
of the
yeah, by
Exodus,
a lot,
uh,
no
a
doubt, by a
long
lot.
time. And then you
But
have
there's a problem then with the sense that I there's also codes of morality and codes of legislation um, around that same time period and after that are similar. I mean, there seem to be so many that are similar. So I find similarities in the code, and I find great differences. I think that they're very different as well. I think that the point of the Code of Hammurabi is very different to the Covenant Code. I think they're very, very different. I think that um, we do find codes that are quite similar, but I find them different as well. I think another issue we run into, and I haven't done a whole lot of research, I'd like to, is the issue of the identity of the sun god that hands the code to the king. There's just there's so many conflicting stories. Who is that sun god? I don't know if you've done research on it, but there's
I
so
believe it's
many
supposed to
different conflicting.
I believe it's supposed to be Aten Ra, if I
Yeah, and then
remember.
I've read that, and then um, I've shockingly read that modern scholars are moving away from that. I don't see why they would, but then again, I don't agree with all modern day scholarship.
I think
They'll.
I think a good portion of it has to do with there's a third century BC writings of a particular priest and historian from Egypt named Manetho or Manetho. I forget exactly how to pronounce it.
Mhm.
Um, and he includes the story of Moses in his writing Egyptica,
Mhm.
and that's where we get the description of Moses actually being an Egyptian, not a Hebrew, and that's where I think a lot of people get the dating down to him living around the time of Amenhotep III and then also Akhenaten, which would place it somewhere in the 1405 to 1367 BC range.
Right. Right. Um, I don't know if you've done research in terms of the name or the identity of that sun god, but even that I find I've seen people try to say that there's a great similarity between the sun god and Yahweh. I don't find that similarity there at all. I think the story in Exodus is. I think the identity of Yahweh in the whole Old Testament is very unique compared to any deity that we see in that time period. So that I found very interesting. Didn't do a whole lot of research on the whole sun god thing, but I did. I saw the images. I read scholarly articles on such. I think that's the one area that we can look at, and I think in terms of how we compare ancient deities, and then we look at how the Old Testament, in particular, not even going into the New yet, the way the Old Testament identifies Yahweh, I think it's very, very different. I don't find anything similar. I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong. If you have, I'd be very interested if you have, but I have not found anything similar in any time in history.
Well, a lot of what people are describing Yahweh as is like now Yahweh, as far as rabbinical scholars have been able to date back, take him back to the Canaanite Vulcan at the very least, or at least the expression of Yahweh. A lot of individuals seem to describe Yahweh as a potential volcano or storm god. Um,
Well,
a,
as an attribute, maybe,
yeah,
but
as
remember that Yahweh isn't always the only term used. I used Yahweh
right.
not as a restrictive term. I used it in the sense of whenever the text talks about Almighty God. That is what I meant.
Mm-hmm.
I know it does vary in terms of the way it uses Yahweh, but in terms of how it describes Almighty God is what I meant. I think that the Old Testament is very unique in that sense, in that no matter how and that no matter how many textual issues we have, and we do, as you know, and as I admit, excuse me, there are textual variants and textual issues. Um, I don't think it affects key doctrines, and one of them being the triunity of God. I think that is one thing that I find very constant in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that's something that's pretty common. A lot of it has to do, I think, with descriptive language of how they describe God speaking to the Israelites and things like that. I'm gonna read this uh, excerpt. It's called "History, Fiction, or Science." This one's by Anatoly Fomenko.
Okay.
He talks about the Egyptian Moses was murdered and his religion was abandoned, but he had an Egyptian retinue with him, the original Levites. A fair number of them survived the massacre and the putting down of the Aten worship. The Levites became the elite of the Jewish people, and they emerged into the confluence of the Jewish tribe, which had come from Egypt under the leadership of Moses and the other tribes which had never been in Egypt. The latter had adopted in the desert the cult of the volcano god, and their leaders was a Midianite priest. I think he said, let us say Jethro or something like that. I think that was just a placeholder name. Uh, and that the decisive event was a compromise. The Levites adopted the volcano god, but insisted on circumcision as a price, with that having been an Egyptian institution, and then everything else was abandoned except for that. Then they talk about the story of Exodus being rewritten from a volcanistic point of view, just as the sun god became overlaid by the volcano god, and Moses is overlaid by the Midianite priest, the original worshiper of the volcano god. We don't really know anything about this other Moses,
Yeah.
in that
Yeah,
he's
and
entirely obscured by the Egyptian Moses, and
I would
so
question where they're getting that idea of the volcano god as well. Is it just an assumption? Are there actual textual manuscripts? Is there any evidence that points towards that?
it
I wonder where he would get that from.
he seems to be, or at least Anatoly Fomenko seems to be drawing quite a bit from this text called Jewish Philosophy and the Crisis of Modernity by Leo Strauss. And he
Oh,
quotes
yeah,
him
I've never read that.
directly, as he
I've
is
never read
often
that, but
described as a masterful, hot-tempered,
what
even
I wonder
violent.
is, I'm curious. Oh, okay, I see. Yeah, I'd like to read that. I wonder if he harkens to any actual Old Testament texts. I've never heard that before.
That I'm not familiar with. I'm was not familiar of the Strauss text myself. I was
Hmm.
only familiar with that little excerpt from Anatoly Fomenko because I
Right,
did read a couple of passages from that book in college during a couple of my history classes. So,
right, yeah.
and another thing that they bring up about that is that there is corroborating evidence that indicates that the Jews did not leave the Levant, and a lot of that has to do with contemporary historical analysis of other tribes of the Levant region, as well as linguistic analysis. You know how when languages encounter each other, or two different peoples encounter each other, there tends to be this melding, of slight adoption of different, usually idiomatic and sometimes axiomatic expressions from one language or linguistic profile to another, and you don't see that. Hebrew seems to remain, for lack of a better term, unsullied by Egyptian idioms and allegory and things like that.
But I would wonder how. I would challenge how that conclusion is reached, because what contemporary texts is are the scholars hearkening to? Not only that, what is the manuscript history of that text, and how are they able? The one thing that I would challenge the most is we we really don't know uh, exactly what language Moses might have been using in certain areas where he's dialoguing in, because
Mm-hmm.
some of these texts, the earliest evidence we've got is in the Septuagint form. So I
Right.
really would challenge that. I don't think that's I don't find that to be a very compelling argument. I think that I would much take earlier historians, such as individual whose writings we have that still exist to this day in pristine format, such as Josephus, that do argue that they did leave the region. I just wonder what contemporary sources he's using or referring to.
Uh, I cannot find the name of the tribe currently, but it seems to be that they were quoting or referencing other tribes that lived in the Levant
Right?
region
Yeah,
at
I
the
imagine he was
time.
referring to that.
Yeah. So I mean, there's so many options at that point. You have influence from uh, the Canaanites themselves, and you have Edomites, the Midianites, uh, the
The
Israel.
problem would
Yeah,
be is comparing the text. You know what I
I
mean?
think so. I think so
That would be a
too.
huge issue. Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, I just don't find it to be a very
I think the only way we could.
compelling
I think the only
argument.
way we could really answer that question, personally speaking, would be to find some papyri
Yeah,
from ancient Egypt from around the time, and then somehow locate a relatively pristine, maybe not even complete, but at least a good chunk of some of the Tanakh or the Torah
right. Yeah, no, I
from that
agree with
time
you in
in the
that term.
original Hebrew, and see if we can compare and
Right.
contrast, and see if we can find any of that idiomatic mixing.
Evidence.
Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, no, I agree completely with you. I think that, but there is the
therein lies the
problem, though.
rub.
Yeah,
Yeah, oh,
that is the
absolutely.
issue. Yeah, that is the issue. So that's kind of why I tend to take, a lot of this modern day scholarship, which tries to look and tries to say this and that. I don't take it that seriously. Even when we look at guys like Irenaeus, unfortunately, he talks about the fact that there is an Aramaic copy of the Gospel of Matthew.
Hmm.
Well, well, I mean, there's just no evidence of it.
No,
I mean,
there
we've
isn't.
never gotten one throughout all this history, and I know that it would be great if we did. I know that we can look, and I've dialogued with scholars before, and then they'll in turn say, "Well, look, there is an Aramaic copy of the Gospel of Matthew. You can go online and you can find it." Yeah, you're right, but it postdates Irenaeus by
Hmm.
about 800 years.
Yeah,
So
by a long time. Yeah.
so that's not the one he's talking about.
No,
So
absolutely not. And
so I mean,
so one wonders what differences you might encounter between the two,
exactly, exactly.
or if this might be an 8 centuries. That's a really long time. Languages change an
A lot,
absolute ton during that
a lot.
time.
Yeah, it
I
has
mean,
changed
heck,
a
you
lot.
you just walk back 500 years, and English is almost entirely unrecognizable
Yeah.
to
I agree with you
what we
there.
speak
Yeah,
today.
yeah, no doubt.
You walk back another 300 years. There's no telling what you're going to be trying to decipher from all of that.
Yeah,
Thankfully, at least with English, we have a really well preserved linguistic history going all the way back to around the time of when Beowulf was written, which is really cool.
oh
Um,
yeah, oh no doubt. Very, very cool.
if only we could have
Definitely.
that for every language, but yeah,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah, unfortunately we don't.
such is life.
Unfortunately we don't. Yeah, unfortunately. But I mean, even though we don't, I know I've got a number of friends. I don't know how, and I'm pretty sure you're pretty well versed in this field. Maybe you've probably heard of groups of individuals that subscribe to Hebrew Verity, that they think that the Hebrew text is the most pristine, despite the fact that it postdates the Septuagint by quite a bit. Um,
Hmm.
really, when we're talking about the text of the Old Testament, even though we don't have the original Hebrew in our hands, I think we can get to the conclusion of really knowing the message even through the Greek, even though that probably sounds like me running my fingers down a chalkboard for people that believe in Hebrew Verity. Really, I
Quite
um I,
possibly, yeah.
yeah, and I love the Greek. I think it's written in a beautiful manner. I think and people need to realize the Greek Septuagint was not written by Christians. It was written by Jews that were trying to preserve their text as the landscape began to become overtaken
Hmm.
by this language. So I mean, they did their best.
Right, and they also wrote it, largely in Koine Greek, which
Yes.
a lot of people, for those that don't understand it, what that means, Koine Greek, for lack of a better term, is kind of what's referred to as redneck or backwater Greek.
Yep.
It's a common Greek. It's not necessarily the Greek you would
Common.
have
That's
heard
correct.
spoken at the Parthenon, uh,
Correct. You're right.
but it's what you would have heard most of the common folks speak, such as your dock workers, your farmers, your average run of the mill individuals, and that's how cults and religions tend to propagate. Is usually uh, through the common folk, not so much the educated minority.
No, that's correct. You're right about that. That's very true.
One little thing that I have a bit of an issue with when it comes to uh, the book of Exodus and some of the claims that it makes is when you look at uh, chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, it talks about this explosion of the population through there. Like, it talks about how it goes from 70 or 75 to more than a million. And the million is referenced later on in Exodus 12, 37, 38, and chapter 38, 26. And then Numbers chapter 1 references that. And somehow they do this in 4 centuries or less. That's how do they get any work done? I mean, it would be the obvious question. It's like if they're slaves and they're whipping them to move big blocks to wherever, or to build things or to do things. I just it There's really no realistic way to see that. And then that from 70 to 75 to over a million. Okay, that's talking mostly about your fighting age men. It doesn't so much reference individuals like women, children, the elderly, and things like that. So the assumption would be that this number could quite verily be quite a bit higher.
Yeah, first off, when Exodus is talking and when it gives certain numbers, I don't think that the numbers are meant to be taken in a literal fashion. I think Exodus 1 was very clear about that. I think that the message that is trying to be conveyed is the fact that they were indeed fruitful and they were multiplying by the boatloads. But I don't think the numbers are meant to be taken literally. I think Exodus 1 is clear about that. It's just attempting to show that they were multiplying a lot. And if you do look at Exodus 1:7, it says, the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty. I'm looking at the Greek text here. I think the message is simply that they grew in a massive manner. They multiplied by a lot. I don't think necessarily the text is trying to be literal in terms of the numbers that are being conveyed.
Well, I don't know. It seems that they're trying to be as quite literal as possible,
What
because
passage are you referring to?
well, I was referring to that initially to the reference of Exodus 1, 5 through 7, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already, and Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. Then it talks about the verse that you referenced: the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly and multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. But then you go over to 1237, and it's 35 through 37, I think, would be probably one of the more favorable readings. Like, and the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses, and they borrowed the Egyptians jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they lent unto them such things as they required, and they spoiled the Egyptians. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot, that were men beside children. So you've got around a million people that you're trying to move at that point. And the 600,000 men, that's referring, at least from any textual criticism that we've been able to glean from it, is that these are fighting age individuals. At that point, one has to wonder, it's like, how were they even slaves at that point? Because they would outnumber the Egyptian military by quite a lot, considering that the entire population of Egypt was only about 3 million for the entire country during this time.
Yeah, and if you look at 1 Samuel 11, and if you look at Sirach 16, that exact same Greek word is used, and it doesn't literally mean 600,000. It just means an exceeding amount, like a lot of people. So I don't think it's trying to use it in a literalist fashion. I'm not going to lie, I have not examined or studied this Greek word. I'm looking at it barely right now as we're talking. But I'm comparing the way it's used in other passages of the text. And as far as I can see, this is the only time it's ever used. I'm wondering why it was translated like that in the English.
Well, I would also look at Exodus 38:26. A becca for every man, that is half a shekel after the shekel of
Okay,
the sanctuary.
hold on. Before we jump to that one, I just want to hop back to, I think it was Exodus 1:5,
Mm-hmm.
just to make one point before we hop to that one.
Sure.
The 70 souls is not meant to be taken in a literalist fashion. 70, I'm pretty sure you know this, was meant to be in the Bible. It was used in to denote perfection. So it's used all over in the Greek, especially the Septuagint, over and over to denote complete wholeness, perfection. So I don't think that there in particular is meant to be taken in a literal fashion.
Okay.
You're talking about Exodus 38, I think.
Yes, 38, verse 26. In particular, towards the latter half of it, I'll skip the monetary references. It says,
Okay.
for every one that went to be numbered from 20 years old and upward, for 600,000 and 3,550 men. So
Exodus
this
38.
seems to be, yes, 38:26. So this seems to be what's, I mean, this seems to be a fairly, this almost reads as if it's a bill of lading more than anything else, or a full stock of what they have, because you look at the rest of chapter 38, and it's describing exactly what they're doing. You know, he 38:5, and he cast 4 rings for the 4 ends of the grate of brass to be places for the staves. And so you look through this, you see these numeric references throughout the entirety of it, especially this chapter. And so you get to that very specific number of 603,550 for men aged 20 and older, or at least 20 and older by biblical standard, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And so that's where the that 600,000 comes from, of essentially being, you know, over a million people, because if you have 603,550 fighting age men, you know, if we were to use modern population mechanics, you know, men and women tend to be evenly dispersed, so 50-50. So you've got potentially 600,000 women at that point. And that's not even counting children and the elderly, which of course there certainly would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um,
So you're looking at, you know, estimates range between 1 and sometimes upwards of 2 or even 3 million people.
okay,
Now
I
I
find
think
it.
the ones that get
I
kind of
found it.
high, I think that's a little out there, a little ridiculous. The 1 million I can kind of see, because you have this very specific number being referenced of fighting age men, uh, and and that's kind of where I draw the issue, is that during this time I don't even think the Egyptian military had even anywhere close to that number. They didn't have a large standing military because they really didn't have a whole lot of issues with people trying to fight them. Not really. Most of what they
Yeah,
dealt with was nature.
I,
That's why their culture grew so quickly.
yeah, I apologize for going quiet so long. I was
No,
trying
it's
to
okay.
find it in the Septuagint, and it's actually Exodus 39 in the Greek text,
Okay,
which is
okay.
very interesting. Yeah, it changes. Um,
Yeah,
I'm,
definitely.
I'm reading the text. Yeah, I don't know how these terms are used in other passages. I'm trying to examine them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but again, we get into the issue of, and this is an issue we're going to find a lot. The Greek is actually pentekosoi. So we get into the issue of how is this text being used? Are they trying to be literal with the numbers that they're using? I'm not exactly certain if they are, but
With
this text
Exodus
seems to
38,
be.
it certainly appears to be,
It
because
does.
you
Six hundred three thousand 550.
because
It see,
you have that very exact number,
yeah.
but not just that. You also have, let me bring
Yeah,
it
it does
back
seem
up.
to be literal. Yeah, I would argue that this one does seem to be literal.
Right, and I think a good evidence for that would be the references of how they were referring to the pillars and how they were building them,
Yeah. Okay. So
especially.
what was the question in regards to this text?
Uh,
Yeah, I agree. I do think that they're saying that there were this amount of people.
but the question that I have at that point is how were they? We don't see evidence of this in contemporary history, of that many individuals being enslaved during during any point in history of ancient Egypt.
Well, then therein lies the problem, though. What contemporary sources are you comparing it to?
The only
Because
ones we have to compare it to are those within Egypt, because Egypt really didn't have any contemporaries outside of the country. Not really.
exactly, and the problem is,
that there are no manuscripts that we can compare this exact text to that exist that have the pedigree of this exact time period. So how can we? I mean, there's really no way of refuting whether this is accurate or not. I mean, there's really nothing that exists that would refute or even confirm this outside of this text.
So, I mean, I would find that to be the main issue. Does it seem to be like an exaggerated number? Be honest with you, I really don't know. Seems to be quite a big number. And looking from what I see in the Greek, it does seem to be literal. This passage does seem to be trying to make a literal point. But I mean, we run into this so much. The main problem we have is there really is nothing from this exact period that we can compare to that would refute this number.
Yeah, and it looks like we have a little special guest star. My girlfriend's cat Nora decided that my shoulder was a
Oh,
good pitching point.
I didn't see. Oh, there
Yeah,
you
she's
go.
blurred by the background for the most part, but she's okay. Come on.
I love cats.
Yeah, she's a kitten. We just got her not too long ago.
Y'all have more.
Oh no! This is our only pet currently, and that's all I really want for now.
Yeah,
Once we get into a bigger
they're
place, maybe I want a dog. I'm a dog guy. I'm a dog
I
person.
am
Always have been.
too. No, I am too. I've got my, I don't know, I think I told you, right? I've got my old dog. Did I tell you I have a very old dog?
Oh, you said you had a dog. You didn't reference how old they were.
Oh, he's very old. I think he is nearing, I want to say 18 years old.
Wow, what breed is he?
He is a dachshund. He's a wiener dog.
Oh, okay. Yeah, those are they tend to be pretty long lived.
They do. I mean, he's completely blind already, but I mean,
Uh,
he's still kicking. He's still kicking, jumping on chairs and what have you. But great, great, very loyal dogs.
oh, very much so. Very much so.
But I mean, this is a great. I mean, these are all great texts. I'm glad that you're pointing them out. I mean, so interesting dialoguing on these. And another thing that people need to realize, and people might not know, sometimes when we look and we go to Exodus, let's say 38 or Exodus 25, the one thing that people might not know is that the corresponding text there may not be a corresponding um, text that we have in the Hebrew. So the numbering in the Greek Septuagint will be very different. That's why when you pulled up Exodus 38, I was scrambling. I'm like, where is this? I couldn't find it at all.
Right. Yeah. Well, and that has to do a lot with the discrepancies between, of course,
Yes.
Koine Greek, English, and also any other translation in between.
Yes, definitely, yeah, and that is, I mean, it's an issue when you're. I'm sorry, sometimes I kind of get flat-footed. I try to do a little bit of quick translating
Oh no, it's
off the
okay.
fly, but it does. You do run into issues because some words don't quite translate in a perfect manner.
hmm And it seems that from the 14th century BC, which is around when Moses is supposed to have occurred, we do have uh, a actually a really good amount of information from the Hall of Records from Egypt that has a pretty stout pedigree because
But what would
we've
it
got
date to
we've
this
got.
day, though?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, but what would that text, the text that we have that has been, because remember that text is dated to that era,
hmm
but what is the pedigree of that text? How old is that text that exists to this day? Because it's going to be a copy of a copy of a copy. So how old is it? Is what I mean. I mean that is the issue that we always run into. I say
hmm
is that I mean to me that's always the main issue. The fact that these are copies of copies of copies. What is the pedigree of that text? How in depth does that go? Does that actually refute what is being said here? I mean, I can't say that it does or it doesn't, but I mean, I think that those are all issues that arise when we're trying to refute things that are so, I guess, not really details that I think the faith hinges upon. Um, could it be an error? I mean, I just don't think it is. I wonder why such a particular number would be used. Maybe there's a reason why it was used. Maybe that is the information that was passed down. But again,
It could be,
I
and also, chapter 38 could have been written at a different time. It could be,
right, no
it
doubt.
could
Oh,
be,
no
it could
doubt.
be a
Yeah,
different accounting of what was going on at the time, and so we
granted,
lose
granted, no
figurative
doubt.
language in favor of
Could be a
literal language.
scribal error as well. I mean, I don't think it's a scribal error, but just to point out that we have had scribal errors that have corrupted the text.
hmm
Um, I don't. I would argue that they don't. It doesn't change any meaning of the text whatsoever. But sometimes scribal errors leave gaps in the text that, we've got.
issues having to fill those gaps, and the number of times we can't fill those gaps. So we just kind of
Have to
have to
use
hop on
our
over.
best, yeah,
Yeah,
our best
which
judgment,
is
and that's
unfortunate. It really is unfortunate. Yeah.
see someone I'd like to see you have a discussion with. Basically, essentially a historicity discussion would be someone like Dr. Richard Carrier, because I find his Bayesian analysis approach to be actually really kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'd be open to. I've talked to Carrier before. I'd be open to debating Carrier. I've debated a few friends of his. I have talked to him a number of times, and I'd like to reach out to him. Who knows? Maybe we'd even be able to get a debate done, because we did talk about debating a few years back, and I know Carrier. His schedule was very full, so he pointed me towards who did he? Oh, he got me in touch with his friend Crossley, and I ended up debating James Crossley, and we became very good friends. Funny enough, Drew, you're gonna probably laugh at this. Some of my best and closest friends are non-believers, which is really funny.
That's
I'm very
okay. A
good
lot of
friends
my
with
close
Bob
friends
Price.
are
Yeah.
a lot of my close friends are believers. So
There you
it's
go.
kind of how it
There
just
you
kind of how
go.
it goes.
That's how it goes. Yeah. So I would love to have a discussion with Carrier. I think he's a very, very, very intelligent individual. I just disagree heavily when he falls on the side of the whole historical Jesus situation. I think he's very, very off there.
Yeah, a lot of people do tend to think that he's off on that one. Personally, I can't say one way or the other. I still have yet to read um, his historicity book as well as Proving History in their full form to really kind of accurately give an
Yeah.
accurate description of that one or review of that. And I would love to. I that's something that would take quite a while, considering that the main tome of that is over 700 pages.
I
I
think the one
mean,
thing that might help you, I don't know how your schedule is, but I do a lot of traveling. I don't know if you've ever tried Audible. I know it's
I,
available on
I've
Audible.
I've got it as an audiobook.
Oh, you do?
It's
And it's
yes,
it's
yes.
yeah, it's massive. I know.
Yeah,
Even
and
as
it's
an
just finding
audiobook, it
time. It's
is.
just finding time, or
Yeah. No,
having
I
time to
know.
just sit and listen, because it's not really something you can kind of just pick up, put down, pick up, put down.
No, you've
It
got to dedicate time towards
you
it. You
really
have
do.
to.
You
Yeah,
really
because
do.
if you pick it up and you read a little bit of it or hear a little bit of it, and you put it down for a week or a month, you're gonna get lost.
Oh
You
yeah.
really are.
Oh
You
yeah.
really are.
And I really do think that reading Proving History is a distinct prerequisite for
No
that
doubt.
historicity book, because if you don't have at least, I think, a baseline understanding of what Bayesian analysis is.
Yeah. No, I agree. I've always been of the mindset that you must understand your opponent's position in order to be able to argue.
I'm sorry, so that one more time, it kind of cut out a
Yeah,
little bit.
yeah. I have always been of the persuasion that you must understand your opponent's position before ever debating them or arguing against the position. You've got to understand it. You can't just go in there. For instance, I'll give you an example. I don't know if you're aware of this. I debated Bob Price as well, but Bob takes a very different approach to the resurrection than, let's say, a Carrier would or a Dan Barker. And
He does.
it,
He's a textual mythicist, and that's one of the things I
yes,
find really fascinating about him.
I do too. And for me, from my perspective, as a debater, it would have been very disrespectful had I gone into the debate against Bob without knowing the approach that he takes,
Hmm.
because it's a very unique one. And in my opinion, I enjoyed my debate against Bob better than any of the others, because I enjoyed talking with Bob because he's such a bright individual.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think personally, and I know if my friends Dan or John would hear this, they'd probably be upset. I think Bob blows them away in terms of intellect.
Uh,
He's one of the brightest guys out
yeah.
there.
In all honesty, from some of the things that I see and hear, I would argue that sorry, I would actually go so far as to argue that Bob Price is probably one of the best New Testament scholars, at least in this country, if not the world.
I
And
agree.
it's funny that one of your top New Testament scholars is an atheist.
Yeah.
I
Well,
just I
I,
find
I
that
will add this
I find that
qualifier.
hilarious.
I,
It's a bit ironic.
I will add this qualifier, and Bob will admit to you,
Mm-hmm.
Bob prefers being identified as an agnostic more than anything else. He does, and
True,
he'll
true.
tell you if you ask him. He will say, he's like, you know what? He says, I can't tell you whether there is a God or whether there isn't. He said, I prefer being labeled as an agnostic. But either which way, the point you made is still valid. He is an exceptional scholar,
Mm-hmm.
and he does not go into a debate or discussion trying to try not like a lot of these other individuals that will use red herrings as arguments or erect
No.
straw men.
Mm-mm.
He does not do that. And if anybody hears my debate against Dan Barker, that is one of the things I did not like. That Dan Barker will try to use arguments from the biblical Greek, and his arguments are just wrong. And to me, it muddies the water more than anything else when you use arguments like that. It eliminates the ability to have an intellectual dialogue.
I tend to agree with you, especially in that regard. That's one reason why I don't see why a lot of people give. I'll bring this one up. Why a lot of people give Jay Dyer the time of day, aside from the fact that he has garnered some level of popularity,
Yeah.
but it's but I would say it's not through his apologetics. I would say it's more through his work with places like Gaia, where his entire premise is, bringing up esoteric Hollywood, where all he has to do is show this pseudoscientific case of nonsense to try and
Oh yeah,
persuade
no,
you
I agree with you.
to agree with him on something.
Oh, I agree
Um,
100% because I've seen some of the arguments he uses, and even you approaching it from the perspective you're approaching, you can tell when he's arguing against Catholicism, the amount of straw men that he's erecting are just, it's baffling. I mean, this guy approaches it from the point of view of a sedevacantist, and then I found out that he used to be a sedevacantist. So, I'm not surprised at all.
yeah, I was always curious as to how to actually how to always pronounce that one, because I would hear people call each other seeds talking
Oh,
about sedevacantism,
yeah.
but calling each other seeds, and it's like, wait, seed, but that
Yeah,
doesn't
what
make
is
sense. It doesn't
that?
seem to make sense.
Yeah.
And it's like, so what is it? Seed vacantism? Like you have a
Yeah, no, it's
distinct lack of
sedevacantism.
you have a distinct lack of seeds. Okay,
Yeah.
that's wonderful.
Yeah, and they
It's
are, as you know, a growing movement. They're
mhm.
not logical. They don't make any sense. But he a lot of the arguments that he uses, and I could tell. And I really don't care if Jay hears what I say here. I really don't care. Yeah, I really don't care at
I'm a
all.
little guy. What would he care of anything that I say? In all honesty, it's like, but
Well, the thing
if
with
he wants
Jay
to
is,
pick a fight though, I'll talk to him. Sure, I'm not gonna let him get me flustered. I'm not gonna
yeah, I mean,
but
I
I
saw his
doubt he
debate
even
with
sees
Eric.
this or gives this the time of day.
Yeah, Eric beat him. He beat him up. I'm sorry for Jay. Eric beat him up, and Jay.
In all honesty, I think the best Jay Dyer beatdown has to be his most recent with Matt Dillahunty.
I did not hear that debate. I have not heard it.
Oh no, it was glorious, because it's a good old fashioned, because you know how Dillahunty is.
Oh yeah. Oh no
He
doubt.
goes in. He's not gonna let anything slide, and but I do agree with him, is that you see a lot of individuals, especially the ones that he's talked to, who will deliberately try to misrepresent his actual position on things, and Jay attempts this numerous times, and Matt just comes back with, like, no, you're not going to do that. This is what I said. No, that's not what I said. This is what I said. And he does not let him get away with it a single solitary time.
I've
And
got to hear that debate. Yeah,
and
I've got to
and
hear that.
oh, and you want to know the best thing about it? It happened on Jay's channel.
Yeah, that's not good for Jay.
No.
That's not good at all. The one thing that really rubbed me the wrong way when I caught a piece of his debate against Eric, he was flustered. Eric had him on the ropes, and
Especially
to
towards the
try.
end.
Oh, no doubt. And out of desperation, he's supposed to be orthodox. He begins to use arguments that Sedevacantists would use against
Mm-hmm.
Eric. I mean, how desperate do you have to be?
I think
Um,
it more. I think it more has to do with he's still. I would see this when I was still a believer, is that you had those that had what we called that baby faith. They were new to it, and they were still getting into it, and so they threw themselves into it head first, jumped in both feet, and
Yeah.
just started chewing through every single book, every single lecture that they could possibly find. But they would learn, they would be able to regurgitate information amazingly, but they didn't really understand what it was that they were trying to learn.
Yeah.
And I think that has something to do with I think that has something to do with Jay. I'm not saying he doesn't understand what he's talking about when he talks about Eastern Orthodoxy. I just think that he's still new enough in it that
Yeah.
he hasn't fully grasped everything about it, and that's why you see this fallback to sedevacantism and things like that.
No doubt.
Is
Yeah, I
it's
agree.
his comfort zone. You know,
Yeah.
whenever you're up against the ropes, if you've been trying to fight southpaw and you're not a southpaw, you're gonna switch feet and put your power back where you're used to having it.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. And the unfortunate thing is, um, when he is up against the ropes and using those arguments, he sounds very much like a state of a contest, which is unfortunate because the arguments he uses as a state of a contest are so terrible. They're not good. They're easily refutable. And as you know very well, we're going to be doing a roundtable pretty soon with a scholar that is going to talk about those documents that he brought up.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to go ahead and we're going to really talk about the context of them, and we're going to show how he just doesn't know what he's talking about. He really has no clue.
And that's the sad state of things in a lot of cases, especially, online, the old keyboard warrior adage and whatnot.
Yeah.
But getting back to a point you were making earlier is that you can't adequately debate something without understanding their position. I do agree with that to an extent. Now, am I going to... but when it comes to certain things, I believe there are a few things where I don't need to know every single nuanced thing about what a person's beliefs are if they don't apply to what the discussion is.
I agree.
Like, for instance, if you and I were to debate arguments on the existence of God, and say for whatever reason you decided that you were going to do nothing but argue from the point of the modal ontological argument or something like that. I'm not gonna sit there and study what you think about New Testament textual criticism to address what you're talking about with modal ontological arguments, because they're so
yeah, no, I agree.
But that's the thing that kind of annoys me with a lot of individuals, and I think, and I'm gonna take a match to Michael's Sacred Cow of Dr. Ed Fazer, of the way he comes across, at least the way that he addresses people. It comes across in a manner of, oh, well, if you don't have X, Y, and Z credential, and it's in the exact same discipline that I have, then you can't say squat about anything that I've ever said, and you're automatically wrong.
Yeah, I've never heard him make that claim. In fact, I've never really heard much of him at all. But that's unfortunate.
He does it on his blog. Like, he talks about, okay, fallacies physicists fall for, and then proceeds to kind of almost try to advertise himself as being more knowledgeable in physics than physicists. Now, may he be more knowledgeable than one or two physicists? Sure, that's entirely possible. But I don't see him, stepping up on stage with someone like Lawrence Krauss discussing physics and walking away from that feeling like he knows more than that particular individual, at the very least.
Right.
And
yeah, you're bringing up a good point there, because to a certain extent, I guess it depends on the topic that you'd be debating for me to be able to say that you'd have to know your opponent's position. But let me give you one example.
Sure.
In terms of when I debated Bob, it was essential to know his position, because Dan Barker takes such a unique position. He will argue that the early Christians believed in a spiritual resurrection, not an actual bodily one. And then you go to somebody like Bob and somebody like Richard Carrier that believe that, you know what, they're probably just lying to you flat out.
Well,
So
I don't.
such
That's
different positions.
I would say that's kind of a mischaracterization of Bob and Richard on that one. Is that they don't come out and just say it's like, hey, they're lying about this. They, especially Dr. Carrier, he goes about this in a fashion of, it's like using this Bayesian analysis form, using the information that we have access to and the level of research that he did and whatnot. This is the conclusion that he drew, was not necessarily that they were lying, but that it is distinctly possible, or at least likely as not, if not a little more likely than not, that X, Y, and Z was the way things actually happened, as far as the mythicization of a potentially historical individual, or
Wait. Well,
or
but
a
yeah,
historicization or a historicization of a myth. And
right.
there are some
You're
distinct
referring to
parallels that you
Christ,
can.
though. Yeah, but I was talking in particular about the resurrection. Bob
Okay,
has
okay.
told me he does believe those are dishonest, and Carrier has written that as well. I was referring to the
Oh,
resurrection.
okay.
That
I thought you were
particular
referring
those
to
stories.
the
No.
Christology as a whole, not
Oh
necessarily.
no, not
Okay,
at all, not
okay.
at
Now
all.
that we're on the
Yeah,
same page, no.
yeah,
I got you. I got you.
yeah. Which I of course, as a believer, I do believe the resurrection accounts. But I mean, that's a topic for a whole other day. I
I
mean,
think so
that's
too.
I mean, we could actually
Yeah,
dialogue on that for 4 or 5 hours. I mean,
quite
there's
possibly.
so much that could be talked about.
There's a lot we could do
And
on
that is
that
one of
one.
my favorite topics, believe it or not. I'm working on a book just on that. I mean, I
Cool.
love talking about that.
Well, hey, maybe send me an early draft or something when you
I
get
will.
it.
No, I will definitely. So you can see what holes you can poke through it.
I'm all for it. Anthony, who's part of the group that talks to Reason and Theology, has been on one or two times with me. He's going for his master's in textual criticism from oh gosh, I can't remember the name of which theological seminary he's going to be attending. But no, he said he wants to send me his thesis papers.
That's great.
Uh, I, it's like I was like, okay, if I have time, I'll look at them.
Yeah.
I keep getting accused of at least of people around me of being something called an autodidact, and I have no idea how actually relevant that term would even be in its application. I research stuff.
Yeah, which is good. That's good. You try to get to the heart of the issue, which is what is important, really. I mean, you really should. I mean, I have no issue with that at all.
Yeah. Well, jack of all trades, master of none, but is often better than a master of one.
There you go. That's very, very true.
Most people don't know the actual full text of that, and they think it's actually a bad thing to be a jack of all trades. No, it seems to be better to know as much as you possibly can about everything versus hyper specialization. I think.
I agree. No, I agree wholeheartedly.
Well, this has been like an amazing stream that we've had today, and we've still got a ton of stuff that we can
We do.
go through. So I'd like to try and save that, and we'll go ahead and push that off to tomorrow, and we'll do
That'll
our
work.
super uber mega stream. And if we can, I'd like to start oddly enough even earlier,
Not a
if
problem.
at all possible. I do have potentially. A Sunni Muslim from Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, wanted to come on for about 10 minutes pretty early on to kind of give a primer on a couple of things tomorrow morning. And so
Awesome.
I'm hoping I'm able to get that to happen, because it seems that he's going for his master's in criminal justice there in Saudi Arabia. And
Wow.
with me being a political science and law major, I find that immensely interesting, because I think there could be an amazing discussion had
Oh, no doubt.
about Islamic law as a whole. All you really see are just criticisms of it. You don't really see a discussion between non-believers and believers, especially on that topic.
I agree. You really do not. That'd be incredible. I think that would be fantastic. Is that for certain that you're going to be able to get him on?
He says he's okay with coming on tomorrow at 5 p.m. his time, which would be about 9 a.m. Here Central. So, I mean, that's not going to be a very long one. That's just going to be a short little 10-minute kind of introduction, us talking to each other, a little short form video. And hopefully, if there's not too much of a language barrier from either of our parts, that I'm understandable as well as he's understandable, as well as being able to actually discuss these things amicably. I would like to kind of poke and prod at him and see if I can get him to kind of go in depth on Islamic law as a whole with me at some point.
Oh, that'd be a lot of fun.
I think so too.
No doubt, a lot of fun.
All right. Well, I think for now at this point, you and I should probably go ahead and give this a close.
Perfect.
Wait. I'm actually gonna pop a couple of things here.
Sure.
There's some questions from Reason and Theology. It look like it's Michael. Michael, if you would please, because we are kind of getting towards the end of it, save those questions, shoot them to me in the chat, or through Facebook, or email them to me, either one, and I will absolutely bring up every one of these tomorrow, first thing when me and Bill here first jump on. Okay, so I want to see those discussed, because those are some really, really good things, because a good portion of them seem to be in New Testament and stuff like that. So I think it's going to be kind of fun.
Yeah, I love talking about the New Testament.
So I think it's going to be fun.
Especially textual issues. That's a blast.
Oh, yeah, always tends to be. So I've got a link down in the description below for patristicpillars.com. Was there any other website or anything you wanted to throw a shout out to, or a place where people can find you, get in contact with you if you, insert shameless plug here?
You know what? They can pretty much find all that they need there on that website. There, I'm updating it. I'm updating it all the time, and I'm going to be updating it tonight as well.
Okay.
They can find a lot of info there. I will be dropping a link as soon as I get that information for that live debate in Fort Worth as well. Hopefully by the end of the week, the following week, I should have that. We should have a location down. Awesome. And I will be popping that there on that website.
Awesome. Sounds like a ton of fun. Well, for anyone interested that's watching or keeping an eye on the Atheist Reformation YouTube channel, I am Drew, the host and creator. You can check me out on Facebook at theatheistreformation.com. I try to post there pretty regularly, at least for show announcements. If you have questions, feel free to drop them there. Can also tweet at me at theatheist.refo when the number 1, link down below. And, against probably my own better judgment, I started up a Patreon. If anyone feels like throwing $1 or $2 and feels that my content is worth that, of course I will graciously accept. And I hope y'all have a wonderful day. So I'm going to go ahead and turn our stream off now.
Awesome.